Okay, some people have questioned our motives and asked us why we're actually doing these videos. And from my standpoint, we have a lot of young, impressionable people that come into our gym and train. And the last thing that we want to do is give them some false information or some information that's going to lead them into some serious trouble. You know, we discuss a lot of things like preemption, things like that. I would hate for one of our guys to go out there and do what we've just instructed and end up going to jail for 10 years and ruining their lives. So from my perspective, that's why I'm really interested in doing these videos.
Yeah, and we've been asked by some of the people watching the videos, is our motive to give a get out of jail free card for people? No, of course it's not. I mean, but what we say is at our school, everyone here is honest, law-abiding citizens. Most martial artists are, and they have an entitlement to know what the law is and how that may impact if they go to defend themselves or a member of their family.
Okay, another question that many people have asked is that, you know, we teach a lot about preemption. Preemption is probably the best form of self-defense in reality. However, it can wind you into a lot of trouble. These videos, some people think that we're against it, and we're not. We're not against it at all. We're just saying that you can do it, but under the right circumstances. Paul, would you like to tell us what the right circumstances are?
Yeah. So certainly you can go back and watch our third video in the series, which was the video on self-defense, or our first video in the series, the escalation of violence. And what I would say about preemption, there will be certain circumstances where preemption will be available to you, and it will be, as we use the term, reasonable and necessary. So for example, an example I heard at training this week, you're in the car park, you're surrounded by a number of people who are going to menace you, they've threatened you, they've threatened they're going to hurt you before, you might know that they've hurt other people before, you might know they have extensive criminal histories, you might know that they're accomplished fighters, they might show you they have weapons. Under those circumstances, if you were surrounded and you honestly believed that your life was at threat and you had no other option but to try and fight your way out of it, then I would say in those circumstances, preemptive striking would be appropriate, and you would have good justification to argue that both to the police, to the prosecuting authority, and if need be, in court. As we've always stated in these videos, we're not saying that it's impossible to argue your way out of a preemptive strike, but what we say, just like in combat, you put yourself in a bad position. It's harder for you to win from that point.
In our women's self-defense programs and our courses, particularly when it comes to sexual assault, we say that it's okay for a woman to claw out a guy's eyes if he's trying to seriously harm them. Now, is that a reasonable use of those techniques?
Yeah, so I think in the context that the young girl was talking about was a rape situation where a guy had pinned her onto the ground, and she had no doubt in her mind that she was going to be sexually assaulted and raped by this offender. Well, in our criminal justice system, sexual assault and rape is one of the most horrendous crimes that anyone can perpetrate on another person and violate their body, their dignity. It can leave long-term illnesses like disease, physical injury, psychological injury. So yes, my humble view as an accredited specialist in criminal law, in those circumstances, if a male was going to rape you and you're a female and you clawed his eyes during that act to get him away from you, you would be justified, and in fact, as I understand it, Jeff, in our syllabus, we would encourage girls in that situation to defend themselves as vigorously as they could and to use all the tools that they had at their disposal to defend themselves.
So by any means necessary?
Yes.
Another question that's been sent in is, why haven't we addressed the cow punch laws? It's so prevalent in the news and in the media. Why haven't we touched on that yet?
We're now at the end of March, and as of this week, the statute hasn't passed through Parliament. So it was passed through the lower house of Parliament, our state legislative functions. It went to the upper house. The Shooters, the Greens and the Labor Party wanted some amendments, and they've argued there's safety net proposals for the legislation. It's been sent back to the lower house. So essentially at this stage, it hasn't passed through Parliament, so it's not concrete law, and anything that we addressed on it would be, in my respectful view, speculation, and we don't really want to be putting any misinformation out there. We don't want to be causing any hysteria. What we would like to do is get the legislation passed, and then we'll review it and we'll give you a considered response to what we say about that legislation once that legislative process has been completed. Okay, just to answer a question I had from one of my Facebook friends, and his question was, when did the criminal justice system go from having its primary focus being the punishment of the offender? And it's actually quite a complicated question, but you can see that some places in the world still very much relish the opportunity to punish an offender. So, for example, there's some parts of the world where you steal something and they'll chop your hand off. There's some parts of the world where they still sentence people to being whipped and lashed. And in those communities, people seem to really enjoy the fact that that's how their offenders will be punished. I like to say in more enlightened communities, and particularly democracies and in Europe, we have a more well-rounded sentencing regime which takes into account a number of factors, and these factors include what's best for the community, what's best for society, what's best for the victims, what's best for the offender, and what's the best outcome that can be achieved. Now, if you look at, I suppose, Western culture going back a number of years, originally things like from the Old Testament, like eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, were prevalent. But I suspect that these days, if the argument was you raped my wife, so hence I get the opportunity now to rape your wife, most people in our community would sense that that wasn't appropriate. What covers sentencing in this state is the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act, and the aims of that act are set out in section 3A. And what that says is the purpose of sentencing is A, to ensure that the offender is adequately punished for the offence, B, to prevent the crime by deterring the offender and other persons from committing similar offences, C, to protect the community from the offender, D, to promote rehabilitation of the offender, C, to make the offender accountable for his actions, and F, to denounce the conduct of the offender, and G, to recognise the harm done to the victim of the crime and the community. Sometimes courts form a view that rehabilitating a young man or a young woman who has committed a crime will be a better long-term outcome than sentencing them for long periods of prison. I'll address in our next question some of the issues which judges and magistrates will look at when they sentence offenders. Okay, another issue that's caused a real lot of controversy in our class and also on the videos and just in the media generally is how people are punished. And as I indicated to you, there's an act of Parliament, the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act, which sets out things which judges are to take into account as mitigating or aggravating features. So, of course, any rational person would understand, and it's contained under section 21A of that Act, any rational person would understand if you actually plan an offence, if you actually go to great detail to try and work out how to commit the offence, and you carry that offence over a long period of time, the planning is a long period of time, that will be an aggravating feature. If the offence is something which is spontaneous, something which isn't planned, something which doesn't have any real planning or long-term objective, it's just something which spontaneously happens, most people would understand that those two categories of offender would be sentenced differently. People would also understand that if you're an offender that has no criminal history, and you have generally in the community been a very, very good person, very productive, you have a job, you might have done some study, you might have done a trade, you might run a business, you might work full time, you might have a wife, you might have children, you might have other people that you look after, you might do community work, you will probably be sentenced differently than somebody who just has a long criminal history and continually commits crimes and continually commits offences. Now, you can look at section 21A of the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act, and it has a list of things which courts can take into account. One of the other principles of sentencing, it says that like offenders should be sentenced similarly. So there's also, when you see the media and you see somebody punch somebody in King's Cross and killed them, and we start having this outcry that that person should get a life sentence or should be locked in jail for the term of their natural life. There's two issues with that. One is the legislation will typically have a maximum penalty, and for those type of offences it's not life in jail. And secondly, there's also a presumption that like offenders should be sentenced the same as other people in similar circumstances to them. So we have case law which judges are bound to follow along with the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act. Now, you're quite free to go onto the internet and look up the Crime Sentencing Procedure Act, but sentencing is a complicated process and it's not as simple as some in the media would have you believe. Thank you.